Hi, welcome back to the Med Device Cyber Podcast. Today we have a guest, Karandeep. We're going to be talking about regulatory affairs, quality management systems, and some of the differences that have come out not recently across the global regulatory affairs perspective. Karandeep comes to us from the UK. I'm your co-host, Christian Espinoza, and I've got the co-hosts here today, Trevor Slattery. I think one of the podcasts we did before I wasn't here, Trevor handled it by himself, but he did a good job. So how's it going, Karandeep, today? I think you're coming from the UK today, right?
That's correct. Thank you for having me on.
Awesome. You want to give a little bit of background on what you do and your organization does? I know you're also a podcast host. Maybe a little bit about your podcast and how many years you've been working on that, and just a little background on you.
Sure. So I'm Karandeep, and I'm founder of QRA Medical, a quality and regulatory consultancy working within the medical devices space. In terms of my background, I actually still come from a pharmaceutical background, which was what my education was based in. So I did a bachelor's in pharmaceutical science and a master's in pharmaceutical quality by design. But it just so happened that when I left university, the first job that I had was actually working within medical devices, and I just kind of kept it going from there. I started working in traditional devices with things like pacemakers, defibrillators at St. Jude Medical, which eventually became Abbott. And over the past sort of 4 to 5 years, I've been doing a lot more in the software, AI, and machine learning space, where that's where it seems that the medical device industry is moving forward as well, not just in other industries as well. Also, outside of that, as you mentioned, Christian, I'm host of the MedTech podcast, which I started back in 2021, which I interview different MedTech leaders, founders, CEOs, experts, etc. in the field, and give them a platform to share their story. I'm also a content creator on LinkedIn as well, for anybody who does follow me on LinkedIn. A lot of people find quality and regulatory often very confusing, and there's a lot of guidance out there. If you was to go out and read the regulations, you probably walk out more confused than when you started. So my point of the content that I make is just trying to make things a little bit more easier to understand effectively.
Awesome. Well, I find quality and regulatory a little bit confusing as well. We had someone on the podcast before that described regulatory as offense and quality as defense. Would you agree with that statement?
Yeah, there is some element of truth for that, because with quality is often about taking a proactive approach. For example, the biggest tool that we use often in quality is often the CAPA, corrective action, preventive action. A lot of companies out there take a corrective action. They wait for something to go wrong and then try to fix it. What quality often tries to encourage is taking a preventive approach. Look for something that may potentially go wrong and put something in place to make sure that thing doesn't go wrong in the future. So yeah, I would somewhat agree with that. Whereas a regulatory, that's more about, getting that market approval, getting the product out there and filling that. Whereas quality is more like a process on the whole thing. So regulatory is for your product, where quality itself is on the company as a whole. And quality really is not a department. It's more of a culture.
I know you mentioned you're doing a lot of work with AI and software as a medical device, which we see as well. The industry is shifting that way. What are some of the biggest challenges you've noticed working with your clients from a consulting perspective when they have software and some sort of AI model?
The issue that I've often found with companies, so let's, for example, I bring them on as a client and they're at version 15. And when I try to go back in time and say, okay, what did version 1 look like? There were never any proper design controls in place. So realistically, they don't really know the changes that got them from V1 to V15. Or in some cases, they would know the high level of it. How did that affect the code? Can it give false positives? Can it give false negatives? What are the risks that come with it? So often just trying to do things like that retrospectively can be difficult. And the second one, Christian, again, timely to the podcast, is of course cybersecurity. They all realize that there needs to be some cybersecurity to it, but then how far do you go? To what extent do you take it? How much cybersecurity is needed? Or in some cases where companies have done cybersecurity, different things like penetration testing, but it's probably done on like a version that's 2 to 3 years old. And now the software has changed so much where they now need to do that level of testing again. And then the company's thinking, okay, great. Does this require a full test? Does it require a partial test? So companies often out there don't really know, because even if you was to go out and read the guidance documents from the FDA, etc., it would tell you that you need cybersecurity, but to what extent, to what sort of testing, and, how often does this testing need to happen? And these are the questions that I often get from clients.
Yeah, and that's an area that we navigate quite often, and a lot of questions come up because the requirement is like typically people say once a year is when you need a penetration test. But as you said, if you've gone from version 1 to 15 and there's significant changes, you probably needed 15 tests if those changes went on in 1 year. What is your perspective, Trevor, with what Karandeep is saying and our clients coming to us about cybersecurity, like in the versions, and do they actually have evidence of the changes between the versions from your experience? Because you're more on the delivery side than I am, obviously.
I think it's perfect timing for this question to come up. Right before we started recording this, I was actually helping a client with this exact question, and that's where do we draw the line between what is a cybersecurity related change and what is not? And there's a little bit of ambiguity. I know the FDA actually just about a week ago published some new updated guidance that provides some clarity on what they're looking at as far as changes that may impact cybersecurity, but it's not an exhaustive list. The examples that they provide are things that'll affect the authentication mechanisms, things that'll affect encryption or how data is transferred or processed. In general, those are really good examples to go by, or any significant alteration of the device functionality that's likely going to need to have some more penetration testing around it. I think where we can see companies getting away without doing additional penetration testing is minor changes, things like cosmetic tweaks or small changes to an algorithm if they have this, AI-enabled cloud platform. If it's not affecting the way that a user can interact with the device, which would be how an attacker interacts with the device, the cybersecurity risk and the cybersecurity modifications are likely going to be a little reduced.
Agree. And one of the areas that I think is challenging is with AI, it technically is not cybersecurity, but I feel like we end up talking to a lot of clients and prospects about this, is like how they train the model with AI. From your experience, Karandeep, is this something that you feel like the industry has a good handle on, like the data they get to train the model, or is this still in its infancy?
In my experience, I'll very much say it's in its infancy because, how do you validate whether that data is good or not? That's the issue with AI. You can have two of exactly the same products. One has a good data source, one has a bad data source, but on paper, they will look exactly the same. The difference is the one with a good data source would have a lot less bias, will give a lot less false positives, false negatives, and probably get better results in comparison to the one with the bad data. But again, when it comes to training, that's one thing that I find, especially from a regulatory perspective, is not really looked into. What is the validity of the data that they're using to train that particular model?
Do you feel like the regulatory authorities have a decent handle on making sure the model has the proper training, or are they really, I guess, putting that responsibility on the manufacturer?
I think it's very much on the manufacturer. I mean, if you was to look at regulatory bodies, FDA, etc., how many people out there actually understand AI, machine learning software? The chances are going to be very, very few. So what they often do when it comes to regulatory is a documentation check. They're not really playing around with the device or testing the data or seeing really how it works. They're just relying on the documents that have been given to them and using that for a regulatory approval. So again, if it looks great on paper, then that may well be the case, but there may not be that it works well in reality.
And from a cybersecurity perspective, Trevor, what are some of the things that have changed that we have to look at when there's software as a medical device with AI, for instance?
AI is still such a new technology, and some of the cybersecurity threats that are being discovered in it are coming out at a pretty astonishing rate. At the same way that any new technology, a lot of risk is going to be discovered. So trying to stay on top of a rapidly evolving technology where the attackers are trying to understand it just as quickly as the defenders, and each one of them sort of becomes a cat and mouse game to try to figure out who's able to push the security research forward the fastest. So I think that's a little bit of a unique challenge that comes up every once in a while. I know a recent example of that was around 2008, 2009, when smartphones were becoming far more prevalent. Every medical device had a companion app attached to it largely for marketing purposes, to say we have a medical app. And then the FDA started to clamp down, started to regulate these as medical applications. And so now all the regulations were enforced as far as how you're handling security in this application. But the threat landscape was running wild at that point, since it was just such a new concept and people weren't really sure what could go wrong there. So I think we're seeing a similar case with AI.
And with quality, I know, Karandeep, you do regulatory and quality, and QMS is part of what you do, and ISO 1345. Where do you see, like, kind of what you mentioned earlier, like version 1 to 15, that there should be the design history file in the QMS. Like, why is there such a gap? Is it an awareness problem? Is it a funding problem? Like, and we have the same thing with cybersecurity. There's like this big gap people don't really think about till later. From your lens, what do you think the reason is for that gap?
So my view is when they start the software development phase, the last thing they think about is quality or regulatory, and they start thinking about the quality management system when it comes to a time to think, okay, great, we're a medical device and we want to get regulatory approval in a year or two from now. But by then they're already on version 7, 8 or 9, etc. And they've built that without a quality management system. So there never was really a design control process in place at the time in terms of how to do it. Or if there was a design control process in place, it wasn't really to the standard of which is required under 13485. So I think that's really where the gap comes into it. But then my view here is what I always say to companies is in your early stages, just have a partial quality management system. You're going to want document controls. You're going to want record controls. You're going to want design change history files, etc. But these things ain't just limited to medical devices. You know, you want document controls. You want to have records. You want to record changes. You want to see how changes are made. So my recommendation for the listeners out there, if you're in your early stages, just adopt a partial QMS. It doesn't have to be a big fancy system. It could be paper-based, but just have some sort of change. And then ideally try to follow 13485 principles. So that when you are ready to have a full quality management system, it's more of a seamless transition into it.
When do people typically engage with you? Probably like too late to hear your advice you just gave, right?
I mean, ideally, I should be there at the start, but then what do companies do is they think, hey, great, this is it. We've got this product. It works. It's fantastic. We've been to conferences. Everybody likes it. Let's get regulated. And it's just not as simple as that, right? And they're like, and particularly with companies, what do they try to do? And you guys have probably seen it as well. Our product has 50 different claims. It can detect 50 different types of cancer. And I'm like, guys, yeah, it doesn't really work like that. You can maybe have 2 or 3 different indications. And it's also dependent on your clinical data as well. So often they come to me at the very late stages, but ideally they should be coming right at the start. And then what I often say to companies, if you build quality and regulatory at the beginning, it's actually cheaper in the long run. You know, trying to fix something and do things in retrospective, like the example I was mentioning, like design history files, etc. It's somewhat impossible or like very difficult to do. And there's always going to be gaps. And then sometimes trying to patch something is a lot more time costly than it is to just do it properly from the start. So the answer to the question is, ideally, yes, they should be there at the start, but they often come at the very late stages and expect me to work some sort of magic and somehow get it through.
What do you think, Trevor? Is that similar situation for us?
Yeah, I was going to say that sounds about exactly like the way we answered that same question. So,
well, I think from an innovator perspective, I try to look at the world through other people's lens. If I'm trying to come up with a product that I don't know anyone wants it, you know, it's an MVP, the minimum viable product. Why would I care about regulatory or cybersecurity when I don't even know if this thing is a good fit for the market, right? I mean, that's probably the dilemma they're facing. So, you know, if you're talking to an innovator, how would you address that perspective? I'll start with you, Trevor, and then I'll go over to you, Karandeep.
I think it comes down to having your technology, having your product. If it's something that you're creating because you see a market fit, you want to prove that market fit. And if you're able to do that, if you're able to prove you have a market fit, if you've covered all of your bases and you do actually have a good product, then you want to ensure you have your quality all the way going back. Similar to quality from the actual quality perspective, I think cybersecurity it should typically be thought of as quality in software or quality in a product. Safe products are good products. They're high quality products. So assuming that your product does have this market fit that you see and you will be able to convey that to potential investors, to potential customers, then you want to make sure that you have the best version of that product that you can put forward. And the best version of that is going to be a secure, high quality, safe product.
What do you think about that, Karandeep? That cybersecurity is part of the quality?
It should be really. It should be part of your quality management system. It should be part of your procedures. You know, every time there's a design change, for example, under 13485, there has to be some sort of impact on the quality management system. There should also be an assessment, you know, on risk as well. Cybersecurity is also part of your risk management. So yeah, cybersecurity really needs to be interwoven within your procedures. And also people need to realize that, particularly software developers, have you guys ever tried to tell a software developer what to do? They probably don't like that in most cases, right? So yeah, you've definitely experienced that. They're fantastic at what they do.
Typically,
they're fantastic at what they do. They're very great at their job. But, you know, trying to tell them to work in an agile fashion or a design change, they're used to, you know, I want to add this feature, change a couple of buttons in the code and press enter. In medical device world, we can't do that. We need design inputs, we need design outputs, we need design reviews, we have to record everything. And sometimes software developers think, hey, you know, this is just a small change, I just put it through. And then somebody like me in regulatory comes and goes, hold on a minute, why is there a change in the algorithm? It's like, oh, currently we just made it slightly easier to do. I'm like, you've just introduced new risks. And this is sometimes there's a communication what that needs to be done. So realistically is companies need to change their mindset, because what happens in software medical device companies, they act as a software medical device company. Sorry, they act as a software company that just happens to be a medical device. They need to flip the mindset into they're a medical device that just happens to be a software. With that approach, a lot of these things make sense.
What do you think about IEC 62304? If I'm a software development company, I supposedly comply with IEC 62304. That means I develop secure software with the documentation in terms of medical device for medical device. Do you think that standard is actually helping, or are people actually following that standard? I'll start with you, Trevor, then I'll go over to Karandeep on that one.
I do think that it's helpful. I know it's getting a little bit dated at this point, and so I think that, and I know that
what's dated about it?
The last change to it was, gosh, it's an older standard. I think the finalized version was published in 2006. So development has changed a lot since then, as the technology is the same way that I was talking about how cybersecurity risk has evolved so quickly with these evolving technologies. Development practices and software documentation, software testing, software verification and validation are changing in the same way as all these new technologies are getting introduced into a product. So I think that it's not the same landscape for developing a medical device anymore. Developers aren't using the same tools. They aren't using the same procedures. They aren't using the same frameworks. And I think that some of the guidance documents need to change a little bit to accommodate for the recency of some of these later technologies. But having said that, I still think it's a great starting point. It talks about some of the secure steps in a secure software development lifecycle. So that's covering that total product lifecycle the FDA wants to see, and make sure that developers aren't just going in and making changes because they don't think it's going to be a significant impact. They're able to follow a clear, reproducible step and have all the documentation to support it.
Cool. And what's your perspective, Karandeep?
So how often is the word validation used in the IEC 62304 standard? The answer is never. It's not used once. So yes, it's a great standard, but it talks about software verification, but it doesn't talk about validation. And that's, I think, where 62304 falls short. And just as Trevor was saying, it's back from 2006. This idea of standalone software and AI machine learning was something that you saw, in sci-fi movies or Hollywood films, etc. You never thought this idea of it being a standalone software medical device. So I think it's a great framework and a starting point. But if you're just compliant to 62304, that's just like the bare bones. There's a lot more that you need to do on top of that.
It's an interesting point that it doesn't talk about validation. So let's just kind of unpack that for a second so everyone understands the difference between verification and validation. Do you want to explain the difference, Karandeep?
Sure. So in simple terms is, let's just say you go to the electronics store and you buy a television. Verification is you open the box, there's a television there, there's a remote that comes with it, and there's a power cable. That's verification. Validation is, does it work for you? Does it have Netflix? Does it have Amazon Prime? Does it have all the different things you want it to do? If you want to play games in 144 hertz, does it allow you to do that? So that's what validation is. Is it fit for purpose? Is it fit for what you want to do? And another analogy that I can give is, you go to a suit shop and you get a suit jacket. Verification is, does it have a pocket? Does it have 2 holes for your arms, etc.? Validation is, can you wear it to work? Is it comfortable? Can you move around in it? Is it fit for purpose? So that's the best way to probably describe the difference between verification and validation.
So in your experience, Trevor, and I guess as a whole for both of you, if I'm developing a minimum viable product and my software developers are following IEC 62304, technically they could develop what is designed, but it may not be actually valid in the market, which seems contrary to agile software development. What is your perspective on that, Trevor?
The concept of agile software development is trying to move fast, trying to make changes, and you still have a flow, you still have a V&V process, you have an actual software development documentation and software documentation steps. But I don't think that the traditional, it was sort of like Karandeep was saying, the traditional mindset of we're building software that happens to be a medical device doesn't really apply well. A lot of software companies and a lot of tech companies have the Silicon Valley mindset. They want to go as fast as they can. They want to just put something out, see if there's a fit for it. If not, move on to the next iteration until they find that fit. Moving quickly like that works in non-regulated industries, but it doesn't work very well in the medical space. So something like 62304 is trying to slow that process down and have a set of steps that manufacturers and developers should take to ensure they aren't introducing risk into their device. Again, it's still just sort of that baseline for security that engineers should implement into the product. But in general, I think just having good reproducible steps and not trying to do things as this rapidly evolving cycle is a good way for medical device engineers and manufacturers to go about the development process so that they don't have just a runaway train of these versions that they can't keep track of. Their design history file is 5 versions back. They don't have documentation supporting the current version of the product, and it's all just in the engineers' heads. So I think that these are good standards to try to push away from that, but they might need a little bit more refinement as far as how they're doing it.
Yeah, I think what Karandeep said, and you backed it up, Trevor, is we're developing a medical device that happens to have software versus the Silicon Valley mindset. And I think I didn't think about it from that lens before, but I think that's one of the biggest challenges is that Silicon Valley mindset, whereas this is a highly regulated industry. And I used to do cybersecurity for aircraft, commercial aircraft, and it's the same concept. It's highly regulated. You can't just build a prototype plane very cheaply and test it because it may crash and kill people. So it's not quite like that, but it is sort of like that. And I think it's finding that right balance because there's innovation. And there's investors, there's time to market. There's a lot of factors with a regulated industry. It's like, how do you balance those factors to bring something to market cheaply, quickly, and that is actually valid? I think that's one of the challenges we have in the industry. From your perspective, Karandeep, I know you've been in the industry quite some time. Do you feel like this problem we're discussing is evolving? The industry is evolving in the right direction, or are we still kind of like, back when we started a long time ago?
No, there is very much a change. There's definitely guidance documents and things like that coming out. The FDA is doing a really good job of addressing these sort of things when it comes to AI, machine learning, software. Within the EU, we also have the EU AI Act coming in, so we are slowly getting there. But these things are going to take a long time to, just to change a culture or a mindset often takes quite a few years. So I think that's where the real catch is going to be. We can release all the guidance documents, we can release all the different standards, etc. But I think the real difference is just changing that mindset of, going from a software company that, is software first and medical device after, to thinking it as a medical device to software approach. And I think what Trevor was also saying as well, this agile mindset is great for a software development company and it's been around for years and, it's trialed and tested. But it just doesn't really work in medical devices. If you're making changes every 2 weeks, that's a full design control process, arguably depending on the change that you have. And trying to do a full design control process every 2 weeks is just not physically possible. So I think often the agile mindset and medical device regulation and standards, etc., don't really work well together at this moment in time. And I think there needs to be some sort of approach where maybe it's a blend of both.
With one of our clients, Trevor, I know they do constant development. Even though something is their system's already deployed, it's one of the IVD clients. Based on what Karandeep said, what is your thoughts on that, or what are your thoughts?
So I know the client that you're thinking about, and they are a very, very big company. They have a lot more as far as resources available on these projects, on these devices. They have hundreds of developers working on a single IVD system. They have a whole team handling quality and regulatory. And so while they are making pretty frequent changes, and I think they are following agile development, but I think their sprint cycles are closer to 4 weeks to try to accommodate for this. They have dedicated teams to try to navigate this problem. And so when you're able to throw these resources at it and you have a large publicly traded company with the availability to do all of this, I think it becomes a little bit less of a problem. But where the cracks really start to show is with a smaller company, with a startup, where oftentimes you're seeing multiple people wearing or many people wearing many hats, since there aren't enough resources, there isn't enough money to go around to have these huge teams handling all of these complicated problems. And so I think then slowing down a little bit and trying to work just from the ground up, work from a very safe, clear, reproducible process, as opposed to trying to just navigate everything at once, is a little bit of a safer path to go down. Now, having said that, obviously there are companies out there that can get away with doing some more of this continuous development. But I think the main point is that it just shouldn't be taken as the standard, and instead should be taken as the exception to the rule.
So I know quite a few investors, and one of them, his portfolio, 7% of cybersecurity, or not cybersecurity, of MedTech innovators actually succeed. So that's 93% failure rate. So 9 out of 10 roughly fail. Is this just the nature of the business, or is there something that, from a regulatory perspective, could be shifted, or cybersecurity perspective? What are your thoughts on that? I'll go with you first, Karandeep.
Sure. So my view here is, and again, I may sound contradictory when I say I always argue regulatory first, but then I've started to change my mindset a little bit and say reimbursement first. Sometimes there's companies out there who get their 510K approval, get their CE mark. Great, you're on the market, but there's no demand. They haven't looked to see whether the reimbursement was worth it for them, or to see if the customer base was there. Or in some cases, it might be that the product is fantastic and people want to have it, but the healthcare systems may not have the budget for that typical type of product, or it may be too expensive for them, maybe unaffordable. Another mistake I often see with software medical device companies, of course, is they come up with this great software as a medical device that requires X amounts of computer requirements. But how many hospitals have the computing power to be able to use this powerful software medical device? If you step foot into a hospital in the UK, some of the computing systems, and I'm guessing is similar in the US as well, could be 10 to 20 years older compared to what you have at home. So, is it even usable? That is the question that I often say. So I think the failure rate is often high. It's not just, it's regulatory involved, there's reimbursement involved, there's competition, and there could be changes in regulations as well. And also unforeseen circumstances, for example, like a few months ago when we had the FDA layoffs. No one could have predicted that. It could have been the case that, people were saying FDA first, and if these FDA layoffs stayed in place, that maybe the US will not be a quicker market for them, or maybe the product launch is delayed by a few months. So I think there's a lot of factors involved. But again, that statistic for me working in the industry doesn't really come as a surprise, unfortunately.
So it's a matter of beginning with the end in mind, as I like to say, like know your market, how you're going to get reimbursed, and then work backwards. Because like you said, if you could have the best product ever, but if there's no adoption in a hospital or healthcare delivery organization, it doesn't matter, right? From your experience, Trevor, is this a problem we see with our clients, or are they already thinking about this when they come to us? Like this reimbursement, like the whole which area, which market they want to sell to? Because let me just provide some context. I just got back from Hong Kong and I was in China for a while, and the Chinese market's very different, because if I have software as a medical device deployed in a specific cloud environment, that cloud environment may not be available in China. So if you want to sell to China, you have to think about this a little bit differently, as an example.
I think that we see in the medtech space, there are so many factors. And I know Karandeep was listing a whole lot of the different things that medtech innovators, medtech manufacturers need to consider. And that can even just be thought of as a short list. You have to think about going through every different regulatory step, all these different quality checks, getting through the FDA, the MDR, getting reimbursement. Is your reimbursement going to be sufficient? And oftentimes you're spending millions of dollars to develop these products. So there are so many things that can go wrong throughout the process. I think that's why we're seeing such high failure rates, but because anyone having gaps can lead to delays, can lead to cost overruns, and that can sink a company at these early phases with these startups. For an example, if we're seeing big delays through the FDA approval pathway, if it takes a year to get through for a larger company, that's likely not going to be too big of a deal for them. They already have other products on the market. They're likely publicly traded and backed with a lot of money there. So a year-long delay isn't going to be the end of the world. If there's a year-long regulatory delay for a startup, that oftentimes means the startup is going to fail. So if they don't have every single one of their ducks in a row when it comes time for that submission, they can run into some pretty big problems. And I think that just the amount of things that everyone has to consider in the space is part of what leads to that failure rate.
Yeah, I mean, it's not all doom and gloom, though, right? So these inventions are changing humanity for the better. So I think the bottom line is here, if you're an innovator, you have to consider regulatory, consider cybersecurity, but be very passionate about your device to get it to market, and also work backwards, like which markets you're going to sell to and how you're going to get reimbursed. So what are some of the tips then from because we talked about like the failure rate, there's also the success rate too, the flip side of it. The companies that are successful, the startups, what do they do differently then besides the reimbursement? From a regulatory perspective, Karandeep, what do you think they do differently to succeed and get the investors to back them and get their product to market?
Could you perhaps rephrase that question, Christian?
Yeah, we talked about the failure rate, like 9 out of 10 startups fail, but the 10% that succeed, what do they do differently from a regulatory perspective, from your point of view?
Just do a bit of market research beforehand. Go to industry conferences. There's tons of conferences that people can go to. Some you have to pay for, some are free. Go online. There's plenty of resources. Talk to VCs, talk to investors, and get a feel for the industry that you're going into without revealing too much of your product. Is there demands in these sort of products? Look at the reimbursement codes online. Okay, how much are you going to get for this particular reimbursement code? How much is it going to cost you to make your device? What sort of profit margins are you looking at? These are very simple things that you can start looking at beforehand. And for example, if you want to go list, for example, say go into the US market, go onto the FDA 510K database, look at predicate devices. Are there predicates out there? Do you need to go down the de novo pathway? Do you need to go down a PMA? These are very simple things that you can just spend a few hours before deciding, do you want to embark on these? And it's surprising how many companies don't do this early on and then later realize, hey, we want to get regulatory approval. How long does it take? And you say, a year plus. And like, oh, wow, we didn't realize it takes that long. But for the companies out there who do a bit of research and go out there, they have that in mind, saying, okay, great, it's going to take about a year or so to get our regulatory process. Let's start building it. But it's kind of funny when I have to have clients coming up to me saying, hey, look, we spoke to a consultant that told us that we can get our CE marking in 6 months, and they have no technical files, no clinical. They're like, well, I don't know what industry that consultant was from, but, no way in hell are you getting a CE mark or FDA approval with nothing built or no documentation, no quality management system in 6 months. It's just not going to happen.
What's your perspective on the ones that succeed, Trevor? The 10%.
I think it goes back to starting with the end in mind and just covering all of your bases early on. Before you start developing your product, what standards are going to be relevant? How are you developing the product securely and not rushing into things? And it's a little bit of just reiteration of what we've been talking about throughout this episode, but really going into what are you going to need to be compliant with as soon as you understand your market fit? Where are you going to sell your product? What are your customers going to be? Are you going to try to sell into private hospitals? Are you looking for going into Mayo Clinic, Johns Hopkins? They all have their own requirements if you're going to go into these different hospitals. And moving backwards from there, how are you going to develop your product to get to this end goal in mind? Do it safely, do it securely, design it so that you aren't going to run into roadblocks when it comes time for your biocompatibility, for your clinicals, and I know this seems like a little bit of a no-brainer, design your product so that you aren't running into problems, but oftentimes manufacturers will just start designing the product and just start trying to build things. And it goes back to that whole point of the Silicon Valley mindset just not working here. You can't just start designing a product. Start by getting your QMS set up. Start with your IEC 62304, your 81001-5-1, and anything else that you're going to need to worry about going down the line.
All right. I know, Karandeep, I heard, I don't know if it's true, that you like fast cars from somebody. Like, what does that mean? You race cars every now and then, or do you have fast cars?
Yeah, I've owned quite a few fast cars. So I was quite fortunate is when I was quite young, my father had a garage. So I always grew up around cars, and my dad also buys and sells cars. So, I was always being dropped up to school in, anything like crazy American cars, which we don't really get in the UK, going to school in like Dodge Rams. One time my dad even had a Dodge Viper, a few BMW M's, etc. He was always sort of trading cars. So I totally grew up around him. And for me, it's kind of, I always like a diversity of cars. So my favorite car actually is not fast at all. It's a 1973 Morris Marina, and it has a 1.3 liter engine. And the reason it's my favorite car is I can get the back end out at 10 miles an hour in second gear without causing any trouble. It tops up about 55 miles an hour, but it's one of very few cars that I can drive that car to the absolute extreme without being dangerous. So for me, it's about the fun of driving, and that's really what it comes down to. But in terms of racing cars, I'm potentially looking at getting a racing license and taking it to the track. One of my dream journeys, again, being that, I'm not too far from Germany as well, is eventually visiting Nürburgring one of the days, which for the listeners today may not realize is one of the world's most famous tracks, where a lot of people can go there and, test out their cars and see what they can do. But for me, and the benefit that I have, of course, is I live in the English countryside, and we have some of the most beautiful roads, as narrow as they may be. We have very beautiful roads, and if the weather is nice, which again is a rarity in the UK, it's nice to just get the roof down and just go out for a nice drive in the English countryside.
Isn't the Dodge Viper that car you think is the fastest one, Trevor?
The fastest well, I think it was just dethroned, but for many, many years, it was the fastest American car that was commercially produced.
And has the fastest time in the Nuremberg track or course or whatever?
Yeah, it was. And I think it's now a Corvette beat it, but for a long time, it was the fastest American car on the Nuremberg track. Corvettes are a midlife crisis car, in my opinion. They look like a Ferrari.
We have to get on the track someday. I'm working to get my SCCA license, Karandeep, so I can race cars. And in a couple weeks, I'm taking an F4 class. So maybe we'll see each other on the track. Cool. Well, any last minute words of wisdom to any innovators or any regulatory affairs people, anyone listening in on the podcast about quality and regulatory? I'll throw it over to you, Karandeep, and I'll throw it to you, Trevor, for cybersecurity.
Sure. So quality and regulatory doesn't really stifle innovation. It just creates a framework so we can do it quite safely in a regulated space, because the last thing we want is a product going out and killing people. So don't think that quality and regulatory stifles innovation. It just allows it to happen in a controlled and safe manner. So always take it very seriously and don't see it as a burden.
Yeah, and I think from the security lens, goes back to starting with the end in mind. Understand how you are going to, what your end goal is, where you want to get your product, and what you want your product to do, and understand how to do that in a secure way. The frameworks are out there, the standards are there to provide guidance, and then it's just a matter of simply applying them and going through a clear, safe process.
Yeah, what I'll say, something I picked up on this episode is we're designing a medical device. It just happens to have software. Quality doesn't stifle innovation, and neither does cybersecurity. There are things you have to consider in a highly regulated industry where patient lives are at stake. Awesome. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for tuning in, and we hope to see you on the next episode.